everybody. So when I talk to undergraduates, one of the first things they usually ask me is, so how do I get a job like yours? And what I say to them is, what you do in college is really important preparation for your career. I know it was for me, because I spent my time in college running, drinking beer, and oversleeping, which was the perfect preparation for Nike, Coors, and Starwood. But what I want to talk to you about today is change and what it means kind of in a macro sense and what I think the implications are for all of us who have things to do with sales. And I want to start with a story. And the story is this. I was visiting a small country as the CEO of Starwood, and we're going to talk to the government, first the Minister of Tourism and then the Prime Minister, about how to grow tourism. And this is something that I had done a number of times before with people in countries like Mexico or the Emirates or in Thailand. And in this particular case, what I wanted to emphasize was tourism is a great way to develop your economy. It's a great entry point into the working life. It creates opportunities. Travel and tourism is one of the largest employers around the world. But the key as a government is to make sure that you have a balanced approach to advertising and promotion, building infrastructure and airlift, having accommodations, building capacity for what attractions there are. And you need to create an environment where people feel safe to travel and invest. So the government can play a really active role in this. And they were very excited about this. And I thought, wow, this could really be an interesting growth opportunity. This country has sunshine, it's close to Europe, and it has great cuisine and culture and all kinds of things. But there was one problem. It was January of 2011 and the country was Syria. And they were 3 weeks away from falling into a horrific civil war that's still happening today. And yet somehow nobody was thinking about that. And I think it's a great metaphor for how change sneaks up on us in so many different ways. In the hospitality business, in the hotel business, we saw this with the rise of Airbnb, which after 5 or 6 years had more listings than the big 4 hotel companies had rooms available around the world. And the online travel agencies, the OTAs, someone like Booking.com and Expedia had more market capitalization than those big hotel companies, even though they were less than 15 years old. So change is all around us, and it's pretty clear if you reflect on this even for a moment, that a big driver of digital change, is the digital economy. What's happening with the capacity to share and use information. That's pretty obvious. But some of the implications that I think are worth reflecting on for a moment. First of all, is just the order of magnitude improvement that we've seen, right? So over my adult lifetime, the performance of computers has basically improved 1 billion-fold, right? If farming had improved that much over the course of my lifetime, we could feed the whole world with a farm the size of Central Park and still have room for the reservoir, right? We could manufacture everything that we use with like 2 or 3 people. So one thing is just this extraordinary breadth of change, and that continues over time. But the second thing is something that we call the network effect, right? And if you think about a network, basically what it is it's like if you have a phone and nobody else does, it's worthless. If everybody has a phone, it's indispensable. Now, it used to be that creating networks was extremely expensive, thinking about laying railroad tracks or an electricity grid or telephone lines. But the great thing was, once you had a network, it was a huge barrier to entry. Right? If you have 1,000 stores and some other concept comes up, it's going to take them a long time to develop 1,000 stores and develop that network. That all changes with the digital world. The internet is basically a network of networks. So one of the things Sarah mentioned is that I published my first book in January, and I decided to self-publish because I felt, by the way, that the publishing industry was being massively disrupted. But one of the things I was able to do was go on Mad Money with Jim Cramer and talk about my book, which I thought was a great coup as a new author. And we reached about 200,000 people through that show. At the same time, I announced my book on LinkedIn. And within 2.5 weeks, I had 100,000 views on LinkedIn. I'm not exactly a media company, right? So the barriers to entry in networks today are very different, which is one of the reasons disruption can come to any industry in a different way. The other thing about digital technology is, if you think about it this way, it's a general purpose technology. There is no human activity or endeavor that couldn't be made more efficient and effective by being able to use, store, and share information in new and different ways. Which means disruption is coming everywhere. If you don't think that your life and your business is going to be changed by disruption, I suggest maybe you think about that a little bit more. So software really is eating the world, right? And in order to avoid being part of that disruptor's feast, we need to think about what this really means. Why is change so hard for incumbent companies? And I think there are a few reasons why this is true. The first is, I think, the most evident one, and that is anytime there's change, there are people who don't benefit from that change and want to delay and stand in the way of change. I mean, think about this. The US Surgeon General announces in 1964, unequivocally, smoking is bad for your health. And 40 years later, people are still smoking in public places. Why? Because of the tobacco companies, right? They had a vested interest in not having change happen. If you're a fossil fuel company today, you're going to invest in the fallacy that climate change somehow isn't real. Or, by the way, if you're a nationalist politician, if your agenda is nationalism, the last thing you want to do is talk about climate change because it's a global issue. And maybe my favorite example of self-interest standing in the way of change is what Paris taxi drivers do when they don't like something like the incursion of Uber. You've heard about this? So they do this thing called Operation Escargot. They literally slow traffic down to a snail's pace to get people's attention and get what they want. Now, the great thing about self-interest is it's a pretty easy one to see coming. It's pretty easy to understand how to get that out of the way. A more insidious barrier to change, though, is something I call change blindness. So it turns out that what I learned in college about the way the economy works, and that people are somehow utility maximizing, information seeking, rational decision makers, is a bunch of BS, right? I mean, behavioral economists came up with something that anybody who's been in sales or marketing has known all along. People are not only irrational, but they're predictably irrational. I mean, why else would people buy $4,000 handbags or smoke cigarettes or run marathons? We're not a rational species, right? And so what does that mean? If we've been doing things a certain way, we seek confirmation bias in believing that that's still the way we should continue to do things. Do you like to think about things that really bother you, or do you tune those things out? You see disruptors and you come up with reasons why those disruptors actually aren't dangerous for you. I remember when I was at Starwood, we were always trying to find ways to get more promotion, to get more awareness. We had a $24 billion system and a puny $100 million media budget. So I would do basically anything for some more PR. And one of the things we were launching at Sheraton at the time was something called the link at Sheraton. So this whole idea that we multitask and work remotely. And we thought we'd do this cool gimmicky thing. We would ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, but we'd do it from Central Park to celebrate this idea that we can work from everywhere. It's a pretty good idea. We actually got a lot of media attention, but there was one small problem, and it's a bit like the Syria situation. It happened to have been September 15th, 2008. You guys remember that day? It's the day Lehman went bankrupt. So I got these journalists talking to me, and I've been media trained, right? Whatever they ask you, bridge it back to the link at Sheraton. They're asking me about the financial world melting down, and I'm trying to talk to them about this cyber cafe in a hotel. But we get this tunnel vision, right? And by the way, this happens with really smart, rational people too. There's a great physicist who once said, "Science advances one funeral at a time." So change blindness is something we all have to contend with. There's another challenge, I think, for incumbent companies, and it's this. Reconfiguring any large organization is a lot of work. It's really hard, okay? If you think about most companies or large organizations, they're very good at a narrow range of things to do. They've been set up that way. All their KPIs are that way. Their performance measurement for compensation, the people they've promoted, the processes they have in place, the skills they value. Disruption changes all that, and it changes the economic model. And retooling this huge organization and the information systems that go on it is really hard work. So thinking about this, right, I mean, I guess one of the great metaphors that I saw in looking at disruption is from the 19th century. And there was a time when steamships and cargo and sailing were competing for which technology was going to be the best way to get goods around the world. And the thing was, steam kept getting better, and it was more reliable, it was faster, it had more capacity, but the sailing guys didn't want to give up. By the way, the first steamship that was commercially functional was in 1807. In 1907, 100 years later, people are still trying to make better sailing ships to compete with steam. And they finally came up with one called the Thomas Lawson. It had 7 masts. I'm sure all the measures of and I don't know anything about sailing, right? But of like hull speed and sail to cargo, all that stuff must have been just awesome. It was the fastest ship they could make. Well, there was only one problem. In order to make it so fast, it was really unstable. And as soon as there was a storm, the wind came, it sunk, and that was the end of sailing as a way of transporting goods. And I think it's an important metaphor to make sure that what you're not building today is the best wind ship for transporting goods in an era of steam. So those are some of the barriers to change that we see in terms of organizations. But there's also something inherent to change itself. And I tend to think of change in a pretty simplistic way as being one of two things. There's trend line change, and there's disruptive, abrupt change. And trend lines, my currency trader friends call it this way. They say the trend is your friend. What you see as a trend today is likely to continue on tomorrow. So if you've taken geology, you know from plate tectonics, North America is moving at about 2 centimeters, about an inch a year. And you know what? It's going to do that every year for as long as I'm breathing and on this earth, and probably for a lot of millennia past that. That's a trend line, right? Moore's Law, we were talking about before with digital technology. It's been going on for 50 years. That's a trend line that's probably going to continue. Over the next 25 to 30 years, another 3 billion people will join the global middle class around the world. That's a trend line that's probably going to be hard to break. Every month, 4 to 5 million people move to cities somewhere around the world. That's like creating a new Boston every month, and that's going to happen for the next 30 or 40 years. If we keep emitting greenhouse gases, global temperatures are going to go up. These are all trend lines. You can kind of bank on these things. But then there's disruptive change. This is abrupt and unpredictable. So North America is moving a little bit at a time. We don't know when the next big earthquake is going to come. That's the disruption, right? That's that unpredictable part of change that we don't know about. The Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, gets caused by people moving to cities, climate changing so farmers can't grow their crops, people communicating through social media, and suddenly you've got a social explosion that no one saw coming. You know, it seems like a really good idea to deregulate banks and let them lever up and have something called the Great Moderation until you wake up and find out that the financial system is about to melt down. That's that abrupt, disruptive change, right? And a way to think about this is, if you went back to 2000 and you were going to predict what computing power and capability was going to be in 2005, and 2010, 2015, 2020, you'd probably be pretty accurate. That's a trend line. What you wouldn't know in 2000 was what the iPhone was going to do, or what iTunes or the App Store or Spotify or a bunch of other things were going to do. You wouldn't be able to predict the rise of Facebook. And that's really, I think, part of the challenge of disruption. So if we think about this, right? We've got this accelerating pace of change. We've got organizations that are not necessarily set up not to be devoured in that feast. And we've got change that's going to continue to be driven by trends, but punctuated by these unpredictable events that are going to change our lives and our businesses in ways and how to work. So let me start to talk to you a little bit about what I think that means for all of us from a sales perspective. And as I was thinking about this, I came up with what I decided were about 7 themes I wanted to share with you. And I thought about calling them sort of the 7 deadly sins of sales in the 21st century, but that somehow, to me, felt a little bit negative. So I thought, let me flip it around. Let's call this the 7 life-giving virtues of sales in the 21st century. So there's 7 of them. The first 3 have to do with what I call living at the crossroads. Here's an example. Virtue number 1, be seamlessly global. But one day I woke up at Starwood and I realized that 35 to 40% of our growth in the next couple of years were going to be hotel openings in China. Now, we're this Connecticut-based company. No one on our leadership team is Chinese. No one actually speaks Chinese on our leadership team. And we're sitting far away trying to decide what we should be doing in China. I said, this is nuts. So someone came up with a brilliant idea. Actually, it was my wife. She said, why don't you go move headquarters there for 6 weeks? And I thought, that sounds like a really good idea. And I came to the office expecting someone to say why that couldn't work, and no one came up with a good reason not to do it. And I don't think it's just because I was the CEO and they didn't want to say it. There was no good reason not to do it. So we moved our headquarters to China. not to oversee what our colleagues were doing there, not to try to make sure we were managing them better, but to find out what we could do to help them continue to grow. And you know what happened? We accelerated our growth in terms of the number of hotels. The hotels we had open performed better. And we went from 100,000 to over 2 million active SPG members. But here's the thing about being seamlessly global. You know, we only talk about big global companies as if those two words have to be together. Global is for the little guy now, right? I advise a company called PlacePass up in Boston, which is a startup company. It's about 1.5 years old. And it's basically a meta search engine for travel services. And I looked at the list of the first 11 customers they had. They were from 7 different countries. I mean, this is a company with like 4 people, right? Don't wait to be global. Because here's another thing about this. In all those cities, millennials that are using technology, they have more and more needs that are in common with each other around the world than they do necessarily with their home markets. If you're trying to solve a problem in one place in the world, you can bet someone somewhere else is solving the exact same problem. Why would you let them create a business if you could get there first? Don't wait to be global. Another virtue that's tied to living at the crossroads is something I call there is no department, right? Everything we do today is cross-functional. So once upon a time in a hotel company, if you walked in, you'd see marketing over here. They'd be working on a print ad or a promotion or a TV spot. Sales would be calling on their corporate customers, schmoozing people, signing people up. Those poor IT guys back in those days were doing some god-awful, soul-crushing enterprise solution implementation that was going to solve everything and was just a giant pain in the neck. And God bless them, the guys in the hotels were running their hotels hoping no one from headquarters would bother them, right? That's the world we lived in. Fast forward to today. Marketing's saying, wait a minute, the best thing I can do is roll out an innovation and get people to engage with us on an app. How can we do keyless check-in? Sales is saying, wow, if you can do keyless check-in, I want to make sure that goes on the app for my accounts. That's a unique selling point. But wait a minute, that means we need the technology guys in the room to help figure out how we make this actually work. Oh, and by the way, it changes the way hotels allocate rooms and work, so we better get some of them in the room together. There is no department anymore. There are no siloed functions. We are all working together in a different way. Which gets me to the third way of living at the crossroads, and that's something I call combine old and new. So, one of the great things about being young today is no one has 20 years of social media experience, right? I mean, there are more people managing things that didn't exist when they were in the jobs of those people they're managing than ever before. This is a great time to be young. And those new skills, that ability to use technology to change your business and be disruptive, either internally or in your industry, is critically important. But we can't forget the old skills that are important too, right? If you have the new skills to create a $60 billion ride-sharing empire, you should also have the old skills to know it's a bad idea to berate drivers, whether or not there's a video on. That's just not the right way to go about business, right? In the hospitality business, we looked at technology as being transformative, but we looked at it as a way to help people, right? Hospitality is still about the human touch. It's about, now I don't have to make you wait in line and show me your photo ID and your credit card and do something really unhospitable as soon as you walk into a hotel. We can do all of that using technology so that I can meet you at the door and help you with your bag and ask you how your trip was. You guys know this from sales. You heard Jeffrey just talk about it also. Yeah, technology can help us to know who to call and what the probability of success is, what we might want to pitch to them, who we should send over there. But we all know the sale gets made when you have the meeting face-to-face, when you're sitting over dinner and you build that trust, right? So combine old and new. So those are the 3 life-giving virtues that have to do with living at the crossroads. The next 2 virtues have to do with staying relevant. And the first of these is something that I call brands matter now more than ever. And what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about how brands are important and how they've evolved with technology over time. So let me just take you back in history for a second. Brands came into existence at around the time of the Industrial Revolution. If you go back before then, there's a few examples of brands. Like I found this really cool sword that the Vikings had in the year 1000 because it had some Damascus steel. And if you had one of these swords with the name on it, you scared the crap out of your adversary because your sword would basically crush theirs. But basically, technology and brands didn't really exist in a meaningful way before the Industrial Revolution. So what did the Industrial Revolution do? It moved people from villages into cities. It separated producers from consumers. It used to be if you were going to buy food, you would buy from the farmer you knew, or from the chandler, or you get your clothes from the tailor, and if the clothes fell apart, you knew exactly who to talk to. Mass production, mass distribution, mass media separates producers from consumers. We live in this world of urban isolation at the beginning of the 20th century, and brands emerge as a new promise of reliability, as a proxy for those personal relationships that you used to have with producers. Brands were basically mass, they weren't that differentiated at the time, and they were mostly focused on this kind of very simple price-value relationship. But what happens in the 70s and 80s is everybody gets a television in their house. Suddenly you've got a 30-second or a 60-second color spot, and your brand can showcase itself. It can appeal to people's aspirations. It can appeal to what people want. It can have attitude and personality and positioning. I mean, think about Nike, right? It wasn't just about a better running shoe. That shoe made you cool, right? So that's the next phase of branding, was this creation of personality. And then what happens is, in the mid and late 1990s, we get the internet. And suddenly, anybody, anywhere, can look up whatever information they want. And if you're a brand, and the company behind that brand and the people behind that brand don't share values with their consumers, you got a problem, right? At Nike, we learned this with labor practices in the late 90s in factories. People didn't like the idea of a cool product that was made by people who weren't happy somewhere else. So the company had to get its act together to do that. Brands had to have a purpose. And again, the role of brands changed with what technology was able to provide. So the world we live in today, constant connection, mobile internet access, social media, me as a brand on Facebook. What does that mean now? Brands now not only need to know who their customers and consumers are, people expect their brands to know them and where they are right now and what they need and what they're going to want. And why would it be any different in a B2B environment than it is in a B2C environment, right? I mean, we already talked about the fact that people aren't rational, and they're no more rational when they're running companies than they are when they're going to buy that $4,000 handbag. The role of brand in helping you sell has, however, changed, right? It used to be that brand was about reliability, right? It was, no one ever got fired for hiring IBM. Now, the people you're selling to are thinking about the exact same thing that they are as consumers. Do you know me? Do you know what my company's going through right now? Do you know what disruptive pressures are on me right now? Right? So this whole role of selling has gone from finding customers that you think will want to have your product to going to customers and finding out what product they need and then making sure that you can deliver that and making sure that you can be responsive in real time. And that gets me to the second virtue around this whole idea of staying relevant, and that is innovation works. So I went from Nike to be the CEO of Coors, and at Coors at the time, we'd lost market share and volume for something like 7 or 8 quarters in a row. It's a pretty flat industry. We're -1, -2 week after week. It's painful. So coming from Nike, my first thing I wanted to do was create innovation. And I looked around the room, I said, so what do we have? What's our innovation story? And I don't know if you've ever been in one of those meetings where people are kind of doing this. And I go, come on, guys, we need something. Finally, someone said, we used a red liner in a Killian's can once, and it was a great promotion. Maybe we could do it for Coors Light. And I thought, okay, every can in the world has a liner, but we'll give it a color. And we called it the Frost Brew liner, and we connected to the fact that we made our beer in the Rocky Mountains. And by the way, our competitors were making beer in places like Bayonne, New Jersey, or the San Joaquin Valley, or St. Louis. They couldn't talk about that. And we also know guys who like premium like beer like it cold. So we connected an innovation to a consumer insight, and we bet the whole marketing budget on it, and it worked. Cans went from -5 to +5, -1 to +5, which is like plate tectonic earthquake kind of stuff in the beer business. Which gave us enough time, by the way, to go back and figure out what we could do for bottles, and that's how we came up with the mountains that turn blue. We took bottles from -2 to +5. So innovation works. And the way innovation used to work is the way it worked when I was at Nike, right? We had these guys, these shoe dog kind of product geeks, create some new innovation, once a quarter. Marketing would figure out a way to package and sell it, and we'd design the crap out of it. And then we'd have one of these big brand bomb sales meetings with thousands of people in the room, and we'd sell them on this great new innovation. So that's the way innovation used to work, right? And what started to happen, though, in the world of innovation is you had people like Zara. What did Zara do? They basically figured out a way to take any idea and get it to market 30 days later. So a new style changes, 30 days later, it's on the shop floor. I remember visiting them when I was at Nike, and they actually had Nike product on the floor in some of their design rooms that they were knocking off, right? So innovation became a tighter cycle. And finally, we get to the point where innovation is actually almost negative response time. I mean, think about what happens when you buy a Tesla today. That Tesla is going to be updated with new capabilities based on your and other inputs. So the car you buy today is going to be better 2 years from now in ways that neither you nor Tesla now could be sure of knowing about ahead of time. Negative response time. So in a world where there's no departments and innovation is continuous, and where you're not selling a product that someone's already made, you're selling a solution that someone needs, you and sales are all part of innovation in that whole process together. All right, so those are a couple of life-giving virtues around staying relevant. The last two I want to talk to are be a change agent is the first one. And I talked earlier about how organizations resist change. But it's a fallacy to say that human beings don't like change fundamentally. And why do I say that? Well, I just talked to you about innovation. Innovation wouldn't work if human beings didn't like change. We as consumers love change, but we love change because we have choice and control. So whether it's your own company or the customers you're talking to, think about ways to help them be co-authors of their own future. Give them control and a sense of being able to have input. When we changed something at Starwood, I didn't get up in front of a bunch of hotel general managers and tell them what to do. I said, look, here's 10 of your colleagues. Here are 10 of our best general managers. Here's a solution they've come up with. They've been co-authors of this. Listen to them. Give people a sense of control and choice. There's another species of human being that literally will die for change, and that's revolutionaries. And why do revolutionaries want to die for change? Because they believe in a cause. It's the power of belief and a sense of purpose. Every company has a sense of purpose and a reason to be, a thing they're trying to solve. If you can relate the changes you want to implement back to that fundamental purpose. Look, we're in the hotel business. We're here to make people feel special and recognized every time they interact with us anywhere around the world. How do we make that better? This isn't about me changing your job description. This is about us focusing on a purpose that's really important. And it happens all the time, so be a change agent. And then the final one is something I call less planning, more strategy. See, we used to use the word strategic planning as though that was one thing. I was the head of strategic planning at Nike for a while. But you know what? Planning works really well if you want to create a blueprint and a bunch of KPIs and things that people are going to look at and incentive systems. That works really well in that old world where you've got a big factory somewhere and you've got a hierarchical structure and there's a bunch of white men, making decisions at headquarters and everybody else is sort of running to their tune. It doesn't work when you've got disruption coming up and you've got Airbnb and you've got the OTAs and you've got a million little businesses that are disintermediating and disintegrating your business. Plans and blueprints can create change blindness. The key, though, is to think even more about strategy. Because strategy is about who are we? Who is our customer? What is the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve? How do we make sure that we get ever better at trying to solve those problems for whoever we're working with, whatever our customer is? How do we make sure that we continue not to be disintermediated and disintegrated by disruptors? That's what strategy should be about. Okay, so I've talked a little bit here about how the world is changing. Always reminds me a little bit of that one comic where, they got the cartoon where the guy's got a picture, he's a dinosaur giving the speech like I am, and he says, here's the problem, the ice age is coming of a brain the size of a walnut. Remember that one? It's supposed to be funny. Anyway, There's a lot of change coming, but there are things that we can do about it. What all of us do for our organizations, for the people we work with, for the customers we talk to, we can be the solution to that disruption and not have ourselves be that carcass on the table in the disruptor's feast. And with that, I will let you go. Thank you.